It was around midnight on November 14th, 1995, in the Haidian district of Beijing. Bus 375 pulled out of the Yuangmin bus station, headed off on the last trip of the day towards Fragrant Hills. The only two people aboard were a male driver and a female conductor. The night was stormy, with a freezing wind that would howl around the bus and rattle the windows as it drove along the dark streets. When the bus stopped at South Gate, near the Summer Palace, 4 passengers boarded quickly, grateful to be out of the harsh, bitterly cold wind. The 4 passengers were an old lady, a young couple and a young boy. The couple shuffled into seats directly behind the driver, where the old lady sat halfway down the bus on the other side. The boy sat a row in front of the woman, close to the doors, as he stared out the window and tried to work out how long it would be until he could crawl into his warm bed and finally fall asleep. The 6 occupants of the bus were quiet as the bus wound its way through the storm, heading into the quiet, remote streets. The exhausted driver yawned into his fist as his eyes scanned the open, empty road. The only thought in his mind was to get this last journey complete so that he could return home and rest. As his eyes completed another scan of the road, they fell onto something strange. 2 figures by the side of the road, frantically waving him down. At first, he didn't want to stop. These men were not at a designated bus stop, and picking them up would only prolong the time it took to complete his journey and go home. What were they even doing out there? However, the conductor was a kind soul. She expressed her concern about leaving these 2 men in the middle of nowhere so late at night in the freezing wind. After a moment or 2 of discussion, the driver reluctantly pulled to the side of the road, opening the bus doors to let the men climb in. As they entered the bus, the passengers were surprised to see not 2 but 3 men, with the third appearing to be in bad shape. The other 2 were supporting him. His head bowed, he appeared to be unresponsive. Whilst this was a strange sight, even stranger was their dress. All 3 were dressed in traditional robes from the Qin dynasty, outfits that had not been worn for many hundreds of years. The strange way the men were dressed, their deathly pale faces, the fact that one of them was having trouble to stand by himself, and the fact that the 3 were out in the middle of nowhere without an explanation, caused a general feeling of unrest in the passengers, who watched the men and started murmuring to each other. The conductor tried to calm the passengers down, suggesting that maybe the 3 were actors in a production being filmed nearby and simply got lost in the dark and stormy night, or got drunk and forgot to change their clothing. Whilst this calmed several of the passengers, the old woman was not so easily convinced. She tried to talk to the conductor several times, hissing into her ear frantically, until eventually giving up and going back to her seat. She kept glancing back at the 3 men, who had chosen seats behind her further down the bus. Other passengers had started to filter on and off of the bus, and the driver and conductor had started to chat amongst themselves, their looming destination and the ever-approaching end of their shifts, raising their spirits. Fairly soon, it was just the old lady, the young man that had got on at the same stop, and the 3 strange men left on the bus. The wind whistled around the bus as the woman licked her lips and looked back again. She could not keep her eyes from the men as she glanced back again, shivering in the breeze from the window that didn't quite close next to her. After another few minutes, the elderly woman stood up and started shouting, "He stole my purse! My purse!" and pointed at the young boy sat in front of her. The conductor frowned at the commotion and watched as the old woman grabbed the young boy by the collar and marched him to the front of the bus. She tried to calm the situation and find out what had happened, But the old woman remained inconsolable, demanding the driver let them off at the next stop so she could take him to the police station. The young boy could only stammer, completely unable to defend himself against the onslaught of accusations and shouting from the woman. Eventually, the driver had no choice but to pull over and let her drag the bewildered boy from the bus. As the bus pulled away, the woman sighed in relief and dropped her hand from the boy's collar. The boy could only stare at her in shock. "Where is the police station?" the boy asked, having no idea what else to say. The woman just looked at him with a wide grin. "There is no police station. I just saved your life," she replied. The boy stared at her and around at the remote, empty plaza that they had been deposited into, having just gotten off the last bus out of there until morning. "What? How did you save my life?" he exclaimed, his teeth chittering as the wind blew through his clothes. "You remember those 3 men?" the woman asked, seemingly happy and relieved to be in the biting cold, standing on the highway road to Fragrant Hills. "Sure, the actors," the boy said, trying to temper his anger towards the old woman. "They weren't actors," she replied. "I kept watching them. I felt something was wrong. Once when I was looking, the wind came through the window and lifted up their robes. They had no feet, no legs. It looked like they were floating. I think they were ghosts." The man stared at her, his mouth open in shock. "Why didn't you tell the bus driver or the conductor?" he asked. The woman shrugged, a forlorn look passing across her face. "I tried to, several times. I asked the conductor to stop the bus, throw the men out, anything. She didn't want to listen. She said I was just spooked from the storm, but I knew I had to get off that bus, and I knew I had to save your life too, so I made up that lie to get us off the bus." "Well, what do we do now?" the boy asked, looking around him at the dark and empty street. "There is a police station not far. I wasn't lying about that. I think we need to report this to the police. Maybe they can save the driver and conductor." Having no choice but to follow, the young boy watched as the woman recounted the whole story to the police. He would chime in to agree with her on various parts, such as the strange trio of men and the false accusations. When asked if he'd seen the men float, the boy could only shrug. He'd been spooked by the men, certainly, but he hadn't been watching and couldn't say if they had legs or not. The police didn't even bother to write the report, merely trying to calm the woman down and arrange to get the 2 passengers back to their homes safely. The boy, finally relieved to be home and safe from that nightmare trip, tucked up in his warm bed and fell asleep quickly. The next day, the bus company was forced to issue a statement. "The last bus for Route 375 to Fragrant Hills vanished en route last night, having never reached its destination. Both the driver and conductor were reported missing, and a search was carried out for them. Both the old woman and the boy were found and interviewed on the news, and the story of the 3 ghostly passengers was soon well known. It took 3 days for the police to locate the bus, which had been submerged in the Myung Reservoir around 100 kilometres away from the final stop at Fragrant Hills. Inside there were 5 bodies: the driver, the conductor, and 3 unknown persons, located in a seat towards the back of the bus. To this day, 3 mysteries prevail surrounding this event. Details so bizarre that they left the police and everyone else scratching their heads. The first mystery was that the bus did not have enough fuel on board that night to travel the 100 kilometres from where it was last seen to the reservoir where it was found. When the police learned of this, they opened the tank to find it completely filled with fresh blood. No one knows how the bus managed to make the journey or how the blood managed to get into the tank. The second mystery was that even though they had been seen alive just days earlier, the decomposition of the bodies of the driver and conductor was so advanced it seemed like they had been dead for weeks. Even in the hot summer sun, their bodies should not have been as broken down as they were, and the days that followed the incident had been cold. The examination of all 5 bodies found no tampering with them. It also found that the 3 in the back were in even worse shape. They looked to have died much longer ago than the 2 in the front. How could the bodies decompose so quickly? The third mystery was that every road in and out of the reservoir was covered by CCTV. But when the police looked through the tapes of that night, there was no sign of the bus on any tape. In fact, there was nothing strange at all on all the tapes covering every entrance and exit to the reservoir. So how did the bus manage to get there? It would seem that these answers will never be found.